In this segment, we're going to talk about morphological analysis. Morphological analysis is the idea of taking word forms that we don't really understand or don't necessarily have a way of decomposing and understanding what different features basically those words exhibit. And so this shows up because when we have unseen words in other languages, because it's some form, it's the second person plural form of this rare verb that we've never seen before, we need some way to kind of decompose what's going on. And one way of decomposing it is to say, okay, what's the base form, what's the verb that we're dealing with, and then what are the morphological features that caused it to be inflected in this particular way. Okay, so for example, if we have this sentence in Hungarian, what we might want to do is annotate each word with information that's sort of, we could think of as kind of related to part of speech, but which goes a little bit deeper. For example, this word kormani we recognize is a singular noun with nominative case and is not a proper noun. And so we can go through and kind of tag each of these, words with corresponding features based on what part of speech it is. And this kind of this gives us a lot more information about what's going on in the sentence, particularly if we haven't seen, some of these words before. All right, so the problem of morphological analysis is given a word in context or given a sentence like the one we just saw, we want to predict for these words what their morphological features are. For example, is this singular versus plural? Or is this first person, second person, third person form of this verb? So the typical way that people do this for languages where we have a lot of information is that we first have what's called a lexicon, where basically someone has downloaded essentially all of Wiktionary and we say, okay, you have a word that's spelled like this. I know that that's either going to be the first person present form of this verb or it's going to be the third person imperfect or something like that. And then we say, okay, given those two possibilities, which one is it? And that's going to rely on basically statistical model, a classifier. And so most of these models look sort of like CRFs. Like, you could think of the same sorts of stuff as was useful for part of speech tagging and NER as being useful here. We're trying to say, okay, for this word, we're trying to get some grammatical information about it based on the context, and the same sorts of ideas end up being helpful. What I'll say is that if you go looking for stuff here, there's a lot of work on dealing with this for Arabic, and that's largely because Arabic has a lot of ambiguity in terms of when you see a particular word form, what word is it actually? This kind of analysis and inflection of Arabic is one of the big languages that people look at in this domain. We can also think about the task of what's called inflection, where if you are given a base form of a verb, like I tell you, okay, here's the verb arriver in French, and I want the first person, present singular form of this verb, give me the inflection of it. So a lot of times you could just look this up in a table, right? But we need models that generalize because there's lots of new words and new verbs that are emerging. And so if maybe we're building a machine translation system, it would be helpful to know, all right, in this context, what conjugation should this verb have? And so I did some work on this at Google with John De Niro. And basically the approach was to treat this as a supervised learning problem where we would convert essentially a so-called paradigm or one of these big tables into a set of transformation rules and then predict, given a word like vinden, which of the transformation rules applies in order to actually inflect this thing. And so why is this kind of thing useful? Well, like I said, for machine translation, if we're generating output in a morphologically rich language, we might need to have some sense that we're generating stuff that's both grammatical and kind of well-formed and matches the information in the input. So this is some work from Victor Chahouneau et al., where they were doing phrase-based translation, and they defined a phrase table in terms of lemmas, in terms of base forms of words. And then they took an approach where they translated into base forms in Russian, and then they inflected those words. So you would basically predict just only the base forms of verbs and nouns, and then you would use the kind of table that we saw on the previous slide, or these sorts of ideas to say, okay, how do I actually then go about inflecting it, given the information that I know from the source. And this is helpful because now if you have the second person plural form of some verb that you've never seen before, you actually have a chance of getting it right because you don't rely on having seen it in your MT training data. You can instead get it through this sort of two-stage process. All right, the last kind of morphological analysis task I'll talk about, it's a little bit different than what we've been seeing before, but is the task of Chinese word segmentation. And so when you have a long string of characters, we want to be able to break this up into tokens. And so the kinds of models that people use for this are sort of what you would expect. It looks like kind of predicting boundaries between adjacent pairs of words. And so most of our favorite approaches like LSTM tagging type models or pre-trained models can do pretty well here. And the reason we care about this is that having the right segmentation is really useful for translation. For example, if we have this idea of high blood pressure, splitting this out into high and blood pressure then allows you to translate these two pieces in this sort of independent compositional fashion rather than all joined up together. And so again, this is sort of useful when doing translation, and so this is a fairly common pre-processing task used in a lot of Chinese NLP. So this gives you a sense of how we might want to analyze different factors in morphology. There's really a whole bunch of different tasks here, and the way that these things get applied to downstream settings like translation is quite varied. So there's not really a one-size-fits-all approach here, but these are the kinds of effects that researchers think about when building these sorts of systems and dealing with more morphologically rich languages. That's the end of the segment.